Okay, welcome everybody. Give everyone a minute to come in. Okay. Oh, a few more. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, the editor of My Jewish Learning, and this is the Daf Yomi Week in Review that we run every Thursday to explore what happened in Daf Yomi in the last week. It's really lovely to see so many familiar faces. If you're new today, welcome. We get underway. I just wanted to acknowledge what kind of moment we are in right now. When we met, because we meet every week. When we met last week, we were enjoying the last few days of Sukkot, which our rabbis refer to as Man Simchatenu, the season of our rejoicing. We had just walked through the crucible of repentance, and we had a new blank slate for the year, and we're also celebrating the fall harvest. And so much has happened since then. And I can only imagine that many people on this call are reeling in various ways. So I just want to say that one thing our tradition prescribes in moments of crisis is Torah study. So I just want to invite everyone to just take a moment in their hearts to dedicate the merit of this morning to the souls that have been lost and for the safety of those who are currently in harm's way. And my hope for us is that we can have a small measure of comfort in concentrated Torah study for the next half hour. And I'm going to hand it off to Rabbi Elliot Goldberg.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good morning to those in a similar time zone to me. Wishing you greetings wherever you are. Thank you, Rachel, for that framing for today. Daf Yomi's a 7.5-year journey, so there are bound to be all sorts of different days where we come to the learning of Torah, of Talmud. If you're going to do it every day for 7.5 years, there'll be all sorts of different times. And we're in the moment that we're in, and but we're going to turn to a passage that we encountered this week to spend a little time with the Talmud, and I hope it gives us a pause or nourishment for our souls and ourselves. We often, when we look at what's in the Talmud, talk about content. What's the Talmud saying? What's the content? I also particularly like to focus on process. How are the rabbis talking about a particular text? What are they doing with the text? What choices they make? What choices did they not make? And how does that play out? It chose a passage that we encountered this week that it's in the Talmud. It appears in the Midrash also. It's a relatively well-known one. It might be familiar to you, separate from encountering it in Daf Yomi. And I want to look at what it says. We'll talk about why it's in the Gemara where it is, because it's not on topic of Kiddushin. So I'll give you the hook to why it shows up this week in Daf Yomi. But then I want to look at what the rabbis did in the text and compare it to as the Talmud does, compare it to a different text with a different tradition where a rabbi makes a different choice about how to handle the same material, which can shed some light on not just this passage, but how we look at other passages throughout the Talmud. And that's that. I see in the text, besides people saying hello, that maybe there's some glitchy stream. I'm sorry if I'm glitching. I have pretty smooth internet right now. So I hope everybody's seeing us okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. All right. I'm putting just the link to my sources in the chat. I just put it there, but I'm also going to share my screen for the source that's here. go. And I'm going to start the slideshow. Okay, here we go. So we learned in a Mishnah, well, we have a Mishnah that lists a whole list of things that if you use as part of a betrothal, they don't count. And the text here says, from the Mishnah says, this text we're going to talk about, if a man betroths a woman with meat cooked in milk, she is not betrothed. This whole list is an interesting Mishnah, just thinking about, as a couple comes together to become a family, thinking about, we have all kinds of engagement rituals in our society. And I'm always struck in this chapter about how all the different things that the rabbis consider like you could betroth with, because right, the value of the thing you betroth with just has to be a pruta, which isn't so much. But I know my own wife of 25 plus years wouldn't have been happy if when I proposed to her I came with a cheeseburger cooked in milk that neither of us eat, or doesn't sort of sanctify the moment. But the rabbis have a whole list, and this is on it, just to point out that, right, if the betrothal item is food and that food is meat cooked in milk, which is prohibited under Jewish dietary rules, this is not an eligible betrothal. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? Sorry, a morning typo. From where do we derive this? And what's interesting here is the Gemara is not asking from where do we derive this about betrothal, or it might be, but the answer isn't about that. It seems the Gemara is asking from where do we derive this about the prohibition about meat and milk, and where does that law come from? And there'll be a connection back to betrothal some, but right, how is it that this prohibition about meat and milk expands not just from eating, but to other places? And they quote a very famous text that's in the Midrash and in the Gemara, where Rabbi Ishmael teaches. The Torah states 3 times, Al tevashel gedi b'chalei imo, you don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. The 3 verses are listed here. And Rabbi Ishmael says, because of the 3 times that this verse appears, he brings the following midrash. 1 verse serves to teach the prohibition against eating meat cooked in milk, and 1 verse serves to teach the prohibition against deriving benefit from meat cooked in milk, and 1 verse serves to teach the prohibition against cooking meat and milk. Right? 3 mentions of a verse, so 3 different prohibitions. I know it's in the category of Jewish humor that sometimes only rabbis like. The joke version of this midrash is, right, God was with Moses on Mount Sinai, and God said, Moses is writing down the Torah, and God says to Moses, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses said, you mean we can't eat meat products and milk products together? And God says, no. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, you mean we can't derive any benefit from meat cooked in milk together? And God says, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, that means we can't cook any meat and any milk together. And God sort of throws up God's anthropomorphic hands and says, well, have it your way. And that joke sort of points to the way in which the rabbis expand what in its context might be a much more narrow law to a much broader set of prohibitions, right? We know from ancient sources in the ancient Near East that the cooking of meat and milk was a practice. It was potentially a delicacy. There are still cultures in the Middle East that do that. But it seems that this verse in the Torah is like other verses we have about how we treat animals and kindness, like the commandment that if you're going to take eggs from a nest, you shoo away the mother bird, right? You can't take you have to shoo away the mother bird before you take the eggs from the nest, and you can't take both the mother and the eggs at the same time. Or the rule that a newborn calf has to stay with its mother for a certain amount of time before you can use it as food. This seems to be in that genre, but the rabbis take this and expand this, and a whole section of Jewish dietary laws comes from this. in threefold ways. It's not just what the verse says, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And the rabbis say that means no cooking, no eating, and no benefiting in any way. And there are questions about. I remember having a long conversation with a professor in rabbinical school about this. About how do I, if any of the mutual funds that I own companies that are food companies and sell foods that are mixes of milk and meat, is that benefiting from a mixture of milk and meat? And do I need to put my retirement savings in a portfolio that doesn't have non-kosher food because of this law? And it depends how far you want to expand it. There's a case to be made for that sort of ethical investing based on this rule. But we could see here, what does Rabbi Ishmael do? He takes this verse that's about a particular practice, which literally the verse says, right? You can't cook an animal in the milk of its specific mother, and broadens it to these three categories because of the three times it appears here. And that's how we get all the laws that relate to the separation of milk and meat and all the ways it applies, not just in eating, but also in cooking and also like in benefiting in any way from that. And it's actually the benefiting in any way piece that loops back to our topic, because if a man betroths a woman with meat cooked in milk, there's an assumption that it's a benefit to the two of them. They'd be benefiting by becoming betrothed based on this forbidden mixture. And so that's how this particular text looks at the question, where do we derive this? Right, we get the answer to where do we derive the law as a whole, but it connects back to what our mission is talking about. Because of this prohibition and the three places to which it applies, that makes milk and meat forbidden. This is a classic form of midrash, going back to my opening comment about process. The rabbis are sensitive to repetition in the biblical text. Here we have one verse that appears word for word in three different places, three different contexts. You can look them up. It's sort of sometimes it's an add-on to a whole list of things, but different contexts. And the rabbis say, oh, this appears here three times. It must mean three different things. We've seen this with midrash before. A repetition of something in the Torah leads the rabbis to expand categories. Three verses saying the same thing must be three different rules, and Rabbi Ishmael tells them what they are. But the Gemara immediately follows, pointing out to us that the Mishnah that we're studying clearly is not under the opinion, doesn't follow the opinion of another Tana who teaches something else in a Braita. And they quote Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who says something different from Rabbi Ishmael and what he said in the text we just saw. Shimon ben Yehuda says it's prohibited to eat meat and cooked in milk, but one is permitted to derive benefit from it. So notice his statement at the beginning says he doesn't walk the path of Rabbi Ishmael before, despite the repetition of the verse. He says there's a prohibition to eat meat cooked in milk, but you can derive benefit from the mixture, a different take. And how does he get there? Well, this is his rabbinic midrashic thinking. He says it's stated in Deuteronomy, where our verse comes up, right? For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it's stated with regard to a different prohibition, one related to the fact that we can't eat an unslaughtered animal carcass, right? Meat, for it to be eligible to be eaten, has to be slaughtered in a particular way. If an animal dies on its own, you're not allowed to eat the meat. And in that section, it also says, and you shall be holy to me. So what does Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda say? Just as in the case of the animal carcass, it's prohibited to eat, but you're permitted to derive benefit, because we know from that section, it specifically says you can't eat the carcass, but you can sell it to a non-Jewish person. They can use it. Right? So too, in the case of cooked meat, it should be prohibited to eat, but permitted to benefit from. And why? How does he do that? It's in the language that he used in the verses he quote. Both of these rules are attached to a phrase where it says, be holy people. And because it says kadosh in both places, here Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda makes a comparison between the two contexts because of a common word. right? He's drawing up a parallel conclusion because of similar language used in both places. So the word holy appears in both contexts. So that means because the word is shared, we can take a clear detail of the law about the animal carcass that you can't eat it, but you can benefit from it, and apply that same rule to a mixture of milk and meat, where you can't eat it, but you can benefit from it. So Shimon ben Yehuda does something different, right? Rabbi Ishmael says 3 times a verse appears, it must be 3 rules. Shimon ben Yehuda says, we have 2 situations that use common language. I can take the rule from one law and apply it to the other law. Two different midrashic approaches. And I'm going to stop the share and come back to you for a second here. Then I'm going to say the following to sort of pull this together, and then I'll open things up to hear responses or what you might have to say. So both of these midrashic processes are legitimate rabbinic things, right? If you're a Daf Yomi reader and you've been with us for 3.5 years or so, you've seen both these methodologies used. Repetition allows expansion of categories, or common language allows you to transfer a detail from one place to another. Both are proper midrashic techniques. Both are well in the rabbinic tradition about how to understand the biblical text, and both could be the option. It turns out it's the Rabbi Ishmael text that becomes codified into law. There's no real explanation for why we accept one as opposed to other. That just becomes the one that's accepted. But what I want to note about this is, I think it can be a frustrating piece about the reading of Talmud is, there's no clear rule for a reader or for the rabbis, for that matter, that says when 2 rabbis take 2 different rabbinic midrashic interpretation of the same text and end up in different places, that helps us determine which one we follow and which one we don't. Sometimes if, right, 2 different rabbis use these 2 methodologies, right, the repetition methodology or the common language methodology, we use the repetition as the binding midrash, and sometimes it's the common language one that we use. It reminds me of something that we actually encountered, I don't know, it's a few weeks back, where it said, one of the rabbis said in the Gemara, we don't make halachic decisions based on general rules, right? There are lots of general rules, but we know there are lots of exceptions. And so you can't decide just based on that. And so I guess the warning to the reader of Talmud is, just because you read a particular midrash that suggests a particular derivation of law, that doesn't mean that that's going to be the law, or that doesn't mean that just because in one case we go with one methodology, it doesn't mean that we go with it in all cases. It's a challenge to reading Talmud, because if only one of these 2 one of these 2 midrashim appeared here, you might think, oh, that's how we determine the law. Both of these happen to be part of the tradition, and here the Gemara juxtaposes them both, one against the other. And it's sort of a piece that reminds us that while the Talmud talks about Jewish law, and ultimately its conversations are used to help define the law, Talmud itself might be more about process than about decision at the end. And it was important for it to note, right, we have a Mishnah that's in line with Rabbi Ishmael's midrashic teaching, but not with Rabbi Shimon's. And we have both. And you might want to, just notice that there are 2 different midrashic techniques, and know that they're both okay. And there's a way in which just tradition fell in one place and not the other. The fact that the Mishnah follows the Rabbi Ishmael Bright just suggests that it was already in the time of the Mishnah that they were going that path. But it's sometimes frustrating for readers of Talmud that the Talmud goes in 2 different ways and then doesn't weigh in on which one's better. But really, that's because one isn't better. They're both legitimate ways of reading the text, and there are more ways to read the text than we could choose to practice, because at some point we have to make a decision. And sometimes in the, one thing's chosen, and we might find, another month down the road, two midrashim of parallel structure, just suppose one to the other, where they would go in another place. They would go in a different direction than we went today. And there's no way to predict what the end result will be in a lot of cases when you find new material. You just have to read through and see where it lands, and look at the commentators and codes to see where that lands, and then you find out. And sometimes, I guess the inconsistency or the lack of clarity can be a frustration to readers. I think it's a beautiful thing about the interpretive process that the rabbis are aware that there are multiple readings to different texts. It's not always clear which one is best. We might have to make a choice about how to live these texts ultimately, but in our explanation of them, there are lots of different ways that we can look at the text, even to this piece about what seems like a simple verse in the Torah that appears 3 times could mean 2 very different things depending on how you want to read it and which tools you want to use. All right, that's what I have to share today.
Aaron Boxer notes that he read somewhere that chicken is included as a meat that can't be mixed with a dairy, because someone eating a chicken breast in milk, it might appear to be a mammal cooked in milk, right? So the reason chicken is ambiguous is because chickens don't produce milk, right? So if you don't want to cook a kid in its mother's milk, why would you include a chicken in the animals you can't mix with dairy? And Aaron, I think I remember somewhere in the Mishnah, I don't think we've gotten there yet. There is a rabbi who holds that chicken and dairy is fine. Yeah. That it only applies, that does not end up being codified, but in an alternate universe, if that opinion had been the one that was accepted, chicken parmesan would have been kosher, while beef bourguignon, is that right? Is that cooked in cream sauce? Is that right? Someone tell, I don't know. I'm vegetarian, so I don't really know. But
it's true that chicken is in origin parv, right? Not meat or dairy, like fish. And it became, because in practice we eat chicken like we eat meat, not just today, but going way back. Somehow there's that potential confusion, Rachel, that you said about potentially chicken and meat, but not fish and meat. But right, it's an inconsistency even later. And the Jewish comedian Joel Chasnoff has a great bit about kashrut and separating milk and meat and chicken and fish and that whole thing. You can Google it. It's a great thing to watch. Anyway, sorry.
Great. You've got a hand from Claudette.
Oh, yes.
So Claudette, let me give you power to unmute.
Rabbis, do we know when 2 rabbis hold different opinions, before it was written down into the Mishnah and all that, did their followers follow them in the 2 different directions? Because today, if a rabbi writes on a responsa, their followers follow that, what he's written. So do we know if that happened in those days?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'll give you a Talmudic answer. Like, I have a mixed answer to that. We know some things, we guess some things, and some things we don't know at all. Meaning, right, the Talmudic literature presents, clear positions, like with the House of Hillel and the House of Shammai, as people who interpret the text differently, and that each of those rabbis and schools they established observed on different paths. And there are even stories about how they argued, and stories about how they lived differently, and stories about how they tried to coexist in the text. And so we have a sense that there's a tradition about, in that era, there are these 2 different ways of thought, and that different, based on what school you were in, you would follow different practices. When you get down to the different opinions in the Talmud, sometimes we see echoes of that. There are different traditions from the different centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia, and the different Batei Midrash. We see students following their teachers in different ways there. But it's harder in the Talmud to differentiate between when it's schools of thought that really reflect practice and when it's just the conversation in the Beit Midrash about difference of opinions. So I imagine in the Talmud, there's a mix of places where just people disagree, and it's part of the academic discussion. And there are places where people disagree because practices are different. Similar to today, like, we have a diverse Jewish community where we have different practices and different rabbis or different groups of rabbis suggest different practices or rule on different practices in different ways, and our communities follow them in different ways. Sometimes there are major differences between Jewish denominations. Sometimes there's smaller differences, but we see a plurality of Jewish living today, and I imagine there was some of that back then.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Just
That's
to
a great
add, it's a great question, Claudette. I would add, Rabbi Goldberg, I always think when this kind of question comes up of I'm Hillel and Shammai, who are of course really, really early. They were still when the temple stood, and they had different understandings, I think, of what would I don't remember exactly what the halachic difference is, but the result was they had different ideas about who was a mamzer. And the Talmud tells us that nonetheless, they married each other's daughters. Right? So even though they had different practices and their communities were following them differently, so that in this community might have somebody, right, who is who the other community would in their circumstance consider a mamzer, they would nonetheless marry that person, because Klal Yisrael and Jewish and the wider Jewish community was more important. I think I'm trying to quickly figure out.
There is that text. I would say.
I'm sorry, that wasn't as I wanted it to be. I think we wrote about it in this piece, but it's hard for me to quickly check everything. But I think this is where we encountered it.
It is a tradition, right? There are a couple of sources where the Talmud talks about Hillel and Shammai, despite their differences, getting along. I feel obligated to mention counter sources that say, like Hillel and Shammai, sometimes their students came to blows and sometimes it got violent. So it wasn't all utopian, but I like the utopian text better. And I would just say, Rachel, based on the text that you quoted, actually, my own personal practice, I say this as an individual, not as a legal authority or, I am a rabbi, but I'm not speaking as a rabbi when I say this. Because of that text, Rachel, that you mentioned about Hillel and Shammai, despite their differences, they still marry each other. In my own personal practice, I apply the principle behind that about eating in other people's homes, meaning if you tell me you keep kosher and you've invited me for Shabbat dinner or Sunday brunch, I'm going to eat in your home. I know there are different ways to keep kosher and there are different rules and different things that people apply. And something that I do in my home and something that you do in your home might not be exactly the same. But based on that Hillel and Shammai text, if you tell me you keep kosher, that's enough for me. I don't need to, I don't have a list of 15 questions to say, do you keep kosher this way, this way, this way, this way? And some of that is because, I want my practice, my dietary practice to be, it's part of my Jewish life. I don't want it to be more divisive than it has to be. And, if you're committed to the practice, I'm committed to dining with you. Especially if you make good chicken soup. Anyways,
Without
right, without cream. But I guess. But now see the list, it quickly goes into the rules, right? See how we go there fast. Other comments or questions? I haven't had a chance to peruse the text.
we're at the
We're
top
at
of the
time.
hour. And I don't see anything urgent, but if we missed it, I apologize, and bring the question again next week, please. Please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you in the inbox tomorrow morning and in this class in 1 week. Okay, thank you, Rabbi Goldberg. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the great comments and questions. And we'll see you soon.
Take care, everybody.